Hi everyone, my name is Dodds. I'm a software engineer for myself. I work for myself as a teacher, instructor, and full stack JavaScript engineer. Right now, my biggest thing that might be interesting to some of you is this testingjavascript.com. It's the biggest and best place for you to learn how to test JavaScript on the internet. And my slides, you can find these here. I've got links to tons of resources throughout my slides. This is actually just VS Code. Throughout this, so you can go take a look at those. I'm from Utah, and that's all I have to say about that. I have a wife and 4 kids and a dog. And then there are a whole bunch of other links in here, interesting things that you can go take a look at later. But before we get into the content of this talk, I'd like to invite everybody to please stand. So Ben did this to you yesterday if you went to Ben's talk. But everybody, if you can, if you're physically able, if you want to, please stand up. Put your arms out in front of you like this and squat down and back up. This is called an air squat, air exercise, if you've heard of that. So we're going to do 12 of these together because your body needs this. All right, and I want you to count out loud with me. Ready? 1, 2, you can be a little louder. 3, 4, you're doing so good. 5, 6, 7. Doesn't that feel awesome? 8, your body's like, you can do this. 10, should we start over at 1? No, just kidding. 11, 12. All right, before you sit down, stretch up over your head as high as you can, and then even higher than that, and then stretch over to one side and over to the other. Doesn't that feel so great? Like, wow, thank you. Yes. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for doing that with me. I don't always exercise like I should, and that's why I give talks, so that I can get exercise. Just kidding. Okay, so I like to start out my talks with expectations so that you have an idea of whether or not you should be on Twitter all the time. If you're on Twitter, then you can tweet a picture, and then you can feel good about being on Twitter. It's like, oh yeah, I was sharing. So what this talk is, I'm going to talk about managing open source projects. I've managed a few. And some tips and tricks from personal experience. So my experience is not necessarily your experience, so this is not a definitive guide or perfect advice for all scenarios, because we're all snowflakes. That said, there are quite a few things that I have experienced that hopefully can be learnings for you. And so that's what the goal of the talk is. So, just to give you a little bit, I'll just insert a little bit of background for me, in case you didn't attend the keynote this morning. I maintain over 100 packages on NPM, or I should say I've published over 100 packages on NPM. I don't maintain them all. Some of them have been deprecated in favor of better packages, or some of them have been handed off to other people who are still using the project, so they're better suited to maintain it. But I do maintain a large number of packages, and it's in large part because of some of the things that I do in here that I'm going to show you how I manage to maintain those packages. Okay. Oh, and this is JavaScript. Like I do all things JavaScript. How many people are like JavaScript, NPM, all that? Okay, so most of you. It's kind of hard to avoid JavaScript these days. Haha. So most of my stuff is going to be like JavaScript tools and things, but lots of the things that we talk about will apply regardless of what publishing mechanism you use for whatever platform you're publishing to. So to get started, here are some things that you absolutely must have for you to even be considered an open source project. First, a license. If you don't have a license, then your project is not open source. It is actually code that you've pasted to the internet, and that is different from open source. So make sure that you have a license, read through some, look at projects that you think are cool, read through their licenses, get an idea of what a license is. If you just want me to recommend you one, I use MIT on all of my stuff, and it's great. Code of conduct, I think that this is a must-have for open source projects. Any open source project where you want to build a community of people that are respectful to one another, which I think should be every open source project, needs to have a code of conduct. So the next thing I want to talk about is the project scope, defining that project scope and defining what done means. So a couple of things to help you with that. a roadmap file. I've used this in the past on some of my bigger projects, but I typically just will create issues for the specific things. But sometimes you have some vision for the future that's more than just a single issue. And so having a place where you can spell out, these are the goals of the project, this is what we're trying to get to. And sometimes having a won't list, which I guess that's a spelling error, but having a list of things, no, like people have suggested this, and here are the reasons why, here are links to the issues where we have discussions there. That helps not only you to be able to reference it later, but also anybody who wants to contribute to the project to see, oh, okay, they don't want this project to be like the next gulp. They want it to be its own thing. I bring that up because that's actually something I listed in a roadmap once. Okay, so another thing for helping defining done is extensibility. So I don't think that you want your project to do all of the things. Like, you don't want this to be the kitchen sink, and not only are we the kitchen sink, we also wash your dishes. Like, you don't want it to be everything for everyone, but you can make it be more capable by making it extensible. And so Redux, for example, is pretty much a done project. They haven't had a whole lot of like core changes on the project. It's actually pretty small as well. And the reason that it continues to see innovation is through all the plugins or the middleware that they have implemented. And so they have this plugin architecture that makes it easy to enhance and extend the capabilities of the tool itself. And so by doing that, not only do you make it more usable for other people, but you also enable other people to innovate on top of the thing that you've built. And so I've got a chat that I did with somebody a while ago on how you can make open source libraries extensible, and you can go check that out later if you like. Another thing that I want to talk about is automation. Automating the whole process around open source. If you thought that open source is just like hitting publish to publish your code that you've written and then going back to write code and then hitting publish, whatever, you're in for a real treat, because there's actually a fair bit more to it that you can really save yourself a lot of time if you choose to automate some of your processes. So especially when you are maintaining a plethora of packages, automation can seriously, it will enable you to do more. So through automation, I've been able to create 100 little Kents running around doing all the tasks that are really easy to do automatically. So saving time is not the only reason to automate workflows. A lot of it has to do with being able to stay in context with whatever you're doing and just continue on, let the computers do the job. So a couple of things for automation. First off, simplify the setup of your project. If you want contributors, you don't want them to have to go and install, I don't know, some crazy huge amount of stuff to get going and follow a bunch of scripts and whatever. It's a lot better if you can just have, okay, you clone the project, you go into that project and you run this one script, and that script sets everything up for you on your machine. That script will make sure that the environment is correct, so if you have the wrong things installed, the wrong versions of things installed, that it will warn you and say, hey, would you like to install this? Whatever the case may be, and there are tools that you can use to help you with that. But finding ways to make the setup automatic and as seamless as possible for new contributors is really helpful, not only for the new contributors, but also for you if you want to, you get a new computer and now you have to go set up everything again. So a couple of things that I use for some of this if you're in the NPM ecosystem. NPM run all to run multiple scripts in parallel. Cross-env is a project that I made a few years ago to make it so that you could have scripts that set environment variables that works across both Mac, Linux, and Windows. And then KCD scripts is a toolkit that you can go look into and fork it and whatever to have consistent scripts across a bunch of different projects for lots of automation tasks. It's a pretty cool tool. You check it out. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using it, but forking it and bending it to your own will, I think, is a great idea. Another thing to automate is quality. So if you're not using ESLint or Prettier, I strongly advise that you do. They are very simple tools to get going with, and they provide a ton of value. And I'm not talking about the ESLint rules that tell you that your imports are in the wrong order, because I think that's silly. But there are actual rules that can save you from a lot of trouble. And if you're into it, TypeScript actually makes lots of those rules unnecessary. Not all of them, but many of them. And it eliminates a whole category of bugs. So if you're into typed languages, then TypeScript is also fantastic. And that is another way of automating quality. Prettier, if you're not using Prettier, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands because I know how shameful it is to not use Prettier. No, I don't want to shame anybody, but Prettier saves you so much time. It's a code formatter. Lots of languages have code formatters these days, and I strongly advise that you just forget about all of those, like that love that you have for your own way of writing code, and just use a code formatter. It saves you so much time, especially when people contribute to your project and they don't have the same code style as you do. Having Prettier in there to automatically fix all of their style just saves you a ton of time and energy. So yeah, if you're nitpicking on people's code styling in your PRs, then you're not making a great experience for them to contribute to your project. So avoid that. So automated tests and code coverage. So I've got a couple of tools in here. We've got Jest for your unit and integration tests. Cypress can be really useful, especially if you want to run something in an actual browser. So I've used Cypress on a couple of my open source projects, like React components and that kind of thing. And then I use CodeCove for my coverage reporting, so I get the nice badge. And they have a really cool bot that will show up in your PRs to tell you how the coverage has changed. For all of my open source projects, all of the ones that I maintain regularly and currently, they're at 100% code coverage. So I actually don't feel like I need CodeCove all that much because it's just always 100%. I just like stick it up there because I have that enforced through Jest actually. But having it can be really helpful, especially if you have a larger project that you're trying to get to 100% code coverage or something. Husky and lint stage kind of go hand in hand. To automatically run some scripts when people are committing code, so you can automatically format things. So check those tools out. I don't like the poop emoji, but this is actually their logo for lint stage, so that's why I put that in there. So yeah, the people who are chuckling are the 3-year-olds. They're like, okay. Another piece of automation is to automate your releases. I can't emphasize this enough. If you do no other automation, automating your releases will save you so much time. And I'm not talking about like, yeah, well, NPM automates it. I just hit NPM publish and it's automated, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you merge a pull request, it goes into master, and that gets released automatically. And what's cool about this is I probably merge half of the pull requests from my phone. And half of my releases go out because I merged something from my phone, which I think is so awesome. And so the whole process to getting a release out is we iterate on a pull request until it's something I want to release. I merge it, and it gets released. And so I never get the question from somebody that says, hey, when is this going to be released? Because it always is. It's just they know in a few minutes that's going out. And so it saves me a crazy amount of time. The changelog is automated, and it happens through the git commit history. And I can author the git commits as I merge stuff using the squash and merge feature. So it saves you so much time. So I advise you take a look at semantic release. There are other tools to automate releases, but semantic release is the one that I've been using for years. And it's literally how I'm able to maintain the packages that I do. Most of the packages that I have published in the last year have never even touched my machine at all. I've never downloaded them in the last year because of what semantic release enables me to do, which is just so awesome. It saves me a ton of time. Okay, so community is a huge part of open source. I got into open source because I enjoyed the idea of people using my code, and I stayed in open source because I enjoyed the people and the conversations that I had in there. And as I got into open source, I had no idea how impactful and important the community would be. So I spend a lot of time working with people. If you look at my GitHub contribution graph, it'll show you like where you're spending most of your time. And it progressively goes from lots of code, some pull requests, some issues, and now it's going to more reviewing and merging pull requests and commenting on issues and that kind of thing. Just spend a lot of time working with people because you can create all the code you want, and that's great, but if you aren't serving the needs of the people who are using the open source software, then nobody's going to use it. So the community matters a great deal. So a couple of things for community. So first off, for documentation, I think lots of people see documentation as just this, API documentation. But there are a couple of key things that I've found to be really effective in the way that I write documentation. And the first is, at the top of my repos, after all like the rainbow of badges and stuff that I put on all my repos, I have the problem. And I explain what the problem is that this library is intended to solve. And the reason that's really valuable is when people are going around Google and going around GitHub trying to find the tool that will solve their problem, the first thing they want to know is does my problem match up with this tool? And so if you can describe the problem first, then the people who identify with that problem are going to continue reading, and the people who don't are just going to move on. And the alternative is, if they aren't sure whether your tool will solve their problem, then they're going to file an issue, which is great. I love talking with people, but you get enough of those and it starts to get a little old, and you'd rather not spend your time explaining to everybody what problems this tool solves. So start with the problem. You'll save yourself and other people a lot of time. And then after the problem, explain the solution, because just because a problem meshes, a problem that some tool solves meshes with the problem I have, doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be happy with the solution that they're providing. So I wrote this React component called Downshift, and it solves the problem of autocomplete component or autocomplete experiences and like type ahead, those kinds of experiences. And so somebody sees that and they're like, okay, cool, that matches with my problem. And then I say in the solution that this is a React component, and people say, oh, okay, well, I use Vue, so I'm going to go off and find something that is for Vue. So explaining exactly how your solution solves that problem is also critical. Another thing, as kind of a sub-note to this, is explain what this is not. So what is your project not intended to solve? So an example of this is I wrote a library called React Testing Library. That's what the octopus is, and we've got a goat. And if you want those stickers, I've actually got some, so you can come catch me later. But so the React Testing Library, a lot of people got confused about that because they thought it was a replacement for a testing framework like Jest or Cypress. And it's totally different things. And so in my solution section, I say, no, this replaces Enzyme, if you're familiar with that, but it does not replace Jest. It works alongside. So just getting some clarity for people is probably the first thing that you'd want to have done when people are introduced to your project. Then talk about installation. So if you say npm install whatever, then people who aren't familiar with the npm ecosystem, like remember that people who are coming to your project, yours may be the first project they ever install. And so if they don't know about Node or npm, then they see that line that says npm install whatever, and they're totally confused. So what I do is at the top of that line, I just say, this project is distributed on npm, and that's a link, which comes bundled with Node, and that's a link. And it takes them to where they need to go so that they know exactly like how to be successful in installing your project. And if you have other packages that your project relies on, also mention that those are dependencies of your project that people need to install, like peer dependencies, for example. And then you talk about the API documentation. And having examples is a huge benefit to, or a lot of people really benefit from having examples. And so when you have people ask you a question, how do I use React Testing Library with Redux? Then instead of just answering their question in a little snippet of code, you go off and make an example to explain that like it's in a repo or it's in a code sandbox or whatever it is for your that makes sense for your library. You make that example over there and you give them a link, and then you put that link on a giant list of examples that you have in this page. There was one library I maintained for about a year and a half that by the end of my time with it had over 100 examples on the documentation page of how you use it in these different scenarios. And you'll notice that over time you get fewer how do I use it with this questions, because people don't need to ask because they can see it on the examples page. And even when they do ask, you can really quickly answer those questions. And the other cool thing about this is that other people in the community can start, you make it really easy for people to create these examples themselves, so they can start contributing to those examples as well. Another thing is having tutorials, blog posts, and screencasts and talks. So just different ways to get your content out there about the library, how you use it, why you use it. That's particularly useful for your talks, is getting into the why. What's the philosophy behind your open source project? Why should people give you any of their time to even research this library? I find that sometimes you'll have a talk that's like a 20-minute talk, and somebody goes through basically the README, and just, okay, so now we're going to install it, and we're going to do this. I used to do that a lot. But I found that there's a lot more value in using that talk time, that limited talk time, to give people a reason to investigate it themselves. Because most people can just follow README, especially if you're structuring it in a way that makes sense for them. And so use that talk time to justify the existence of your library or your project, whatever it is. Another thing about community is the sites where your community gathers. And so facilitating that gathering will save you a lot of time, because as your project scales and its users, you can't service all of them, and hopefully you shouldn't have to. And so giving the community a place where they can come together and take care of their own problems together is a wonderful thing, and it saves you a lot of time. So having a chat, I use spectrum.chat. You can check that out. It's fantastic. I find that in some of my libraries, a lot of the questions that I'm getting from people is stuff like, how do I JavaScript? And so having Stack Overflow or some other place where people can ask those more basic questions can be really helpful. You can kind of offload some of those things to other platforms, so that the people asking the question gets a good answer, and the people who are supporting your library also have the time to support everyone. Using issues, of course, I only include this to beg you to not turn them off. And same with pull requests. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those here in a little bit. Another side tip that I wanted to share with you is having memorable short URLs. And the reason that this is really useful, so you have a website or something, and /help just redirects to a resource where people can get help with that. But the reason that I found this to be really useful is because I get a lot of people who say, hey, I need help using this library, and they don't really explain what they need help with. And so you just say, please go here to get help. And that page can say, these are the things that we need so that we can help you best. And half of the time, one of the things that I always have in there as a requirement is to have a reproducible example. And half the time as they're creating that reproducible example, they figure out what the problem was in the first place, because they're trying to extract pieces, and it was actually some totally unrelated thing. So having different short URLs that go to the common links that you're wanting to send people is useful, because the other members of the community might also start sharing those same URLs. That's why it's useful. It's memorable. Also, you don't have to go to your giant list of URLs to copy paste. You just remember it because it's really obvious where things go. Okay, so let's talk about issues here really quick. So with issues, an issue is a gift from the open source community to you. But it's also a responsibility that the person who's filing the issue is taking upon themselves. And so when somebody starts using your project, when they install your project, it is no longer just your project. It's now a shared project across both of you. So they're using your code to produce something of value. And so you can work together through this. And so when somebody files an issue for you, it's kind of a collaboration invitation. And sometimes they have no idea what they're supposed to do, where they should go. And lots of times they come with the expectation that they are somehow your customer and you deserve, or they deserve your time and attention, which you can very kindly correct that kind of attitude. But here are a couple of things that you can do with issues that I found to be helpful. Labels, of course, that's kind of a pretty common thing. If you have a lot of issues, I can see value in labels. Most of my projects have very few issues, at least the ones that I maintain regularly. And so I don't actually use labels a whole lot, but if you have a bunch of issues, I can see that being really helpful. And one of the nice things about that is it gives you an opportunity to communicate to others that, hey, I have seen this, but I don't have time to look at it right now, or I've seen this and I hope somebody else looks at it, depending on the type of label you place on that issue. Another thing that you can do is contributing.md. If you put that file either in the root of your project or in a .github directory in your project, then GitHub will actually show some UI to the side when somebody's making an issue that says, hey, they have a contributing file. Will you go check that out, make sure that you're filing the issue the way that it should be filed. And that actually helps out some of the time. And actually, if somebody opens an issue and then later you update the contributing guidelines and then they go to open a new issue, GitHub will say, hey, the last time you looked at this issue was X date, and that has changed since last time, so go take a look at it again. And then there's the issue template, which I find to be a little bit more useful, where you create this file in your project and it will preload the issues with that template. And you can actually make different templates for different things. So somebody clicks on issue, like new issue, and then they can choose from bug or feature or whatever. So go and investigate issue templates. They're really helpful, a helpful way for you to say, hey, these are the kinds of things that we expect people to give us when they're filing an issue. Because it's not just your job as the open source maintainer. Saved replies also saves you a lot of time. So saved replies is just a built-in feature in GitHub. It's awesome, and I recommend that you use it. And the reason I recommend it is because when you get a lot of issues from people saying, hey, I don't know how to use this library, and like it's an incomplete issue, you'll find yourself saying the same thing many times. And when people say the same thing many times, they start shortening the thing that they're saying because it's taking them so long to type it. And when you shorten things that you say, then it sounds kind of rude. And so instead of like taking all this time to type out this saved reply, or this reply, and then you can actually just save something that's very nice and flowery and like, we love you so much, thank you for this gift of the issue, but you didn't quite fill out the template, so please will you. And so you can save yourself your limited amount of keystrokes to by making a saved reply and still sound nice. And then another thing is get out of the way. So a really quick story. I was maintaining a project called Angular Formally years ago. It was a really cool project for AngularJS forms. And it was a very common thing for me to receive an issue and within minutes respond and say, I'll have a fix out in minutes. And within 10 minutes or less, I'd have a fix of the issue. And I got all the people stroking my ego, like, wow, you're so amazing, how awesome. Like, I wish every library was maintained like this. And it felt great. But boy, is that like the first step toward burnout. So what I started to do was, instead of respond right away, I kind of built this community around the project of people who started watching the repo, and they would get the emails as well for the notifications. And if I just waited like an hour, then one of two things would happen. Some other person who was contributing to the project would respond, and or the person who filed the issue would actually post an update and be like, oh, I actually got it wrong. And so, and I was using it wrong, whatever. And they'll close it themselves. So you save yourself a lot of time and a lot of stress. But you also, it's a community building mechanism by getting out of the way. Another thing that you could try if waiting an hour doesn't work, then you just say, hey, could you do a little bit more investigation and figure out where in the code this problem is surfacing? And often people are up for the challenge. Sometimes they're not, and that's OK, but lots of the times they are. So give people that opportunity. So pull requests, there's actually, those two look very similar. We've got labels, contributing. Instead of an issue template, you have a pull request template. You have saved replies. So all of the same things apply. Get out of the way is a little bit different on this one. I really enjoy pressing that little green button that says merge. That's just a fun experience. But I think as fun as it is for me, I get to do it a lot. And so it'd be really cool if I gave that same experience to other people. And so invite people to contribute to your projects, be maintainers, and hit that little green button to merge the code. So I often will say, I think this looks good. I'd like to have somebody else's eyes on this to take a look at it as well. And anybody else can merge this as soon as somebody else has approved this pull request. And another thing that I recommend is enable people to make the changes themselves. So rather than fixing everything just for them, give them the resources they need to know how to contribute to your project. So that's where your contributing MD file comes in handy. You can explain this is kind of the architecture of things and whatever. And then I have this makeapullrequest.com that just links people to a free course that I have on Egghead.io about making a pull request to a project on GitHub. And so I give people that so they can learn about that process. Because lots of people, maybe they know Git, but they're not familiar with the pull request experience as much. But this will take them from zero Git knowledge to making pull requests. So I give them that to enable them to solve their own problems. OK, so on the side of getting contributors, you can't do all of this stuff on your own. You need to have contributors, especially when the inevitable day comes and you're like, you know, AngularJS was fun, but now I'm all over React. That was my life, and I had a lot of AngularJS projects that I needed to hand off to someone else. And there were some of those projects that didn't have any community. Only users, no contributors. And those projects, they actually died. Nobody's using those anymore. Or the only people using them are also using other age-old technologies. And so getting contributors is really the only way that you can ensure the life of your project. So remember your contributor pipeline. This is a blog post that you can take a look at later by Michael Rogers. But this is what a graphic in that blog post. So the blue is the technical committee, but then everything else we've got actually outside of this user space is like the rest of the world. Okay, so everybody in the world is your potential user. All of your users are potential contributors. All the contributors are potential committers. So the contributors are like the people who are actually answering questions and maybe making one pull request here or there. And then the committers are the ones who actually have commit access. And then for really big projects like Node, which is the one that this blog post was about, you have the technical committee that makes decisions on, like when there's people are disagreeing on how to implement something in particular, the technical committee is the one that meets together to figure out the proper way to resolve the discussion. So remember that contributor pipeline, because if you make any bridge from one to the other difficult, then you will have fewer people there, right? And getting more and more people into the center of the circle is how you can make yourself less relevant, which I think is important. Another thing that Michael says in this blog post is he talks about how the Node project will give commit access to anybody who contributes a non-trivial change to the core. So I don't know how many committers they have, like people who have commit access to the project, but it's got to be a lot. And I know that for lots of people, that's like, whoa, what if they like mess up my repo or something? What if they mess up your repo? Like, who cares? We're using Git, and so we can restore things. It's not actually all that big of a deal, and then we can block those bad actors. Or if it was an honest mistake, then we can forgive them, and they've learned, and it's awesome. So I've found that as I've given commit access freely and early to my contributors, that they are way more invested in the project. Like there's just something like that mantle of responsibility that you hand to these people. They start to assume a lot more of the weight of the maintenance of the project, which is a really cool experience, especially for lots of these people who are wanting to have a positive impact on the world. I think it's really cool. So another encouraged contribution, don't do everything yourself. I just want to say that again. Look for opportunities to hand work off to other people, even if it seems like you could get it done a lot faster yourself, which you likely could because you're the creator of the project in the first place, or you've just been working in the code so much. But even though you could do it faster yourself today, you will not be able to do it faster yourself versus like 100 people contributing to your project. Okay, so having more people in there enables you to get more done. So here's a quick example of that. I had somebody email me and tell me about a bug in one of my projects, and I said, oh yeah, so here's let me zoom in on that. The code for the change you want to make is right here. Be sure to follow the contributing guidelines. And it actually, it took me longer to write this email than it would have been to fix that bug in the project. And this person's like, oh yeah, I forgot, this is open source, I can do that. Let me do that really quick. And they did, and it was awesome. And this is what they said thanks for allowing me to pass my first GitHub PR hurdle so painlessly. And it really is a hurdle for people to get into open source. And it's like, it's not super hard. It's not like a hard thing. It's not rocket science or anything. But it is a new and unfamiliar thing for many people. And so helping do a little bit of hand-holding for people to get over that hurdle can do you a lot of good. And this person has now contributed to other of my projects as well, and other projects. And that's a really rewarding thing. Very cool. I'm just throwing this in here really quick. Please don't commit generated files. I think we've moved on beyond this, but I still see it sometimes, so don't commit generated files. It is confusing. People will make pull requests to the generated file, and you're like, I'm so sorry, but you did it to the wrong file. So yeah, you don't need to commit generated files to Git. It's just confusing. Yeah, so roll out the red carpet for newcomers. Helping newbies helps us all. So labels like help wanted, which is like baked into all GitHub repos, but also good for beginners, helps beginners find issues that are good for them. And then first timers only is a project that I started with Scott Hanselman. And I always think his name is Sean because his Twitter is S Hanselman, and that looks like Sean Hanselman, right? Like S-H-A-N. So I always say his name is Sean, but it's Scott. But yeah, so Scott and I started this first timers only thing where you curate an issue that is like dead simple, and you give very specific steps. Like you even give them code to copy paste. Most of the time, these are like one-line changes where you have a bang equals when it should just be a triple equals or something like it. Just a silly, easy thing to fix. And you kind of guide them in that way. It's super rewarding to do this. It takes a silly amount of time compared to just doing it yourself, fixing the bug or whatever, but it is outrageously rewarding. I strongly advise you just try it once. It is a very fun experience for you and the person who's contributing for the first time. So just making really easy issues for people to contribute to and hand-holding them through that process for the first time. It's very cool. Another project that I'm involved in is all contributors. Really quick, how many of you have used all contributors before? Yeah. If you have, I do have a very limited amount of stickers of all contributors. But basically the idea of all contributors, I would show you, except I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. So you just have to imagine in your mind. But all contributors is basically a table that goes in at the bottom of your README, or it could go into another file, of everybody who's contributed to your project. And the idea is that, yes, we have the GitHub graph that'll show you all the people who have committed to your project, but those are not all of the contributors of your project. There are people answering questions, reviewing PRs, and writing blog posts and tutorials, and all of these different things that are absolutely contributors to your project, and they're not really getting any recognition as far as the GitHub stats show. And so by using this table, you can express your gratitude in a way that is really real and human. And it's been a really rewarding thing for me, and the All Contributors has a bot, so it's just really easy to get people added onto that table. So I really recommend you look into this. There's actually research done on Wikipedia, like how do we get people to continue to contribute after they've done it the first time? And they found that when they give people special recognition for contributing, they will continue to contribute thereafter. So check out all contributors. So just a last couple of things. Having a maintaining markdown file or some maintaining documentation that explains how you maintain the project, like how do releases work, how do you do all these things, is a really good idea. It's even for you if you forget, like you move to a new computer and now, oh shoot, how do I set up my environment, whatever it is. So having a maintaining project there too. So just to review the last few things. So you need a license, code of conduct. Having a roadmap is helpful in defining your extensibility. Automation saves you a silly amount of time. Even though it seems like it'll take you longer to automate it, once you have it automated, it just saves you so much time, especially with more projects. Take your community seriously, community building. Your community turns into your contributors, so treat them really well. And that's all that I have for you. Just a couple resources here. You can check those out. And yeah, thank you very much.